Good morning. On Thursday, I was thrilled to return to hands-on museum research, thanks to Jason Talkin and Megan Macruz here at the National Music Center. Oh, thanks. I had a chance to examine this amplifier, a 1958 Fender Pro owned by the musician Neil Young. As we were examining the inside of the cabinet, we discovered a small slip of masking tape measuring 1 inch by 1/2 inch, barely adhered to the wiring of the preamp tube section of the chassis. After using a swab to gently remove some of the dust, we were able to see a name, Lily. Lily, or Lydia Sanchez Jaymes, is seen in this photo with guitarist Dub Williams, singer Eddie Miller, and Leo Fender to her right. Lily was one of Fender's first employees, and she was responsible for expertly wiring amplifiers in the early days of the company. This amplifier, then, represents 3 facets of its history: Neil Young, the player, Neil Young, the musician, the inventor, Leo Fender, and the worker, Lydia Sanchez Jaymes, who wired it. In the early days of Fender, over 30 women helped produce the company's signature instruments and amplifiers: the Stratocaster electric guitar, the Precision bass, the Princeton Tweed amps, among many other instruments. While the Fender name is on every instrument's headstock, these women's names are often written in pencil on masking tape inside the amplifiers, or scrawled on the underside of the pickguard or on the back of the neck. While the tape has been removed from many of these amps over the years, instruments bearing the names of Lupe, Esperanza, Irene, Gail, and Lily fetch thousands on the market. This paper is about those women. The history of Western instruments is dominated by what historian Catherine Dudley argues is, quote, an emphasis on visionary male founders, with eponymous names like Stradivari, Steinway, and Gibson, to name a few. Collectors and musicians relish in owning and playing vintage instruments by the major makers. Furthermore, musicologist Lucy Wagnerova asserts that these names signify, quote, a personal guarantee of intelligent design and high quality. While instrument makers like Antonio Stradivari likely worked on most, if not all, of the instruments bearing his name, this was not so in the age of mass manufacturing. Industrialized musical instrument factories required teams of laborers to create their instruments, not just a single entity. Furthermore, in assembly lines, it took many workers to create one single instrument. In the era of industrialization and mass production, what does it mean to be a craftsperson? Given the issues of race, class, and gender, who has the opportunity to become an instrument maker? How, as scholars, do we classify the people working on the production line in musical instrument factories? Are they instrument makers as well? Can we incorporate their stories into museum displays, showing that it often takes a village to make one instrument? For collectors and musicians alike, Leo Fender is a musical hero, a tinkerer who built his empire one idea at a time. Fender's guitars and amplifiers, especially from the early days, are now sought-after collector's items. Yet, while Fender was the creative force behind the company, these instruments were produced by a small group of factory workers, many of whom were Mexican-American. In this paper, I will center those laborers and specifically focus on the women who built the early solid-body electric guitars and amplifiers for the Fender empire between the years of the company's founding in 1947 through 1965, when the company was bought by CBS. I argue that the women who built guitars and amplifier at the factory were essential workers who propelled the business to greatness. Yet their work had many gendered components consistent with the time, including being paid low wages and being hired to do small-scale, repetitive tasks. In recent years, scholars have begun to address these women, especially pertaining to their gendered roles and fetishization of the instruments on on the vintage market. However, I want to center and humanize their lives, experiences, and contributions to music history by investigating who they really were. I want to make it clear that my aim of this research is not to sully the name of Leo Fender, but rather to provide a more critical examination of his business dealings in the early days of the company. In addition to secondary sources, my research draws from archival images, oral histories, documentary video, web-borne discussion boards, and the instruments themselves. This research is part of a larger digital humanities project entitled Instrumental Women, which I founded in 2020 to highlight and celebrate the work of women in the instrument building industries, past and present. All right, here we go. Leo Fender established Fender Electric Instrument Company in December of 1947 in Fullerton, California. Fender's work would not have been possible without the generous financial support of his wife, Esther Kloski Fender. Esther worked as a telephone operator and contributed much of her salary to Leo's business, yet she is only mentioned briefly in the literature. One Fender employee reported that on occasion, quote, "It was hard to cash checks in Fullerton, especially if Esther was late in receiving her wages from the phone company," quote, end quote. It seems that without Esther's essential financial contributions, Fender might not have made it past the early days. In these early days of Fender, the operations were financially difficult. Guitar historian Richard Smith writes that Fender was in debt up to his magnifying glasses at the time. Fender fell behind with his creditors due to, quote, "unreliable distribution and unforeseen difficulties with materials." Furthermore, Fender had to take out a lien on his property for failing to pay workers' compensation taxes to the state. Given this financial instability and the business being slow in the spring of 1947, Fender laid off most of the factory workers during slow periods. Given these factors, it is unsurprising that Fender and his managers chose to hire women because he would be able to pay them less. Furthermore, jobs women were assigned were gendered, both due to stereotypes about women's abilities and their temperament. Women's physical attributes, including smaller bodies and hands, have led some people to suggest they are not strong enough to complete certain tasks, or that their smaller fingers are more nimble and better suited to complete these jobs. Tom Wheeler states, in relation to Fender's hiring practices, hiring young women to wire amplifiers, quote, "You don't have to pay a specialist to do point-to-point on the scale Fender was doing it. It was the most practical way to go at the time." Yet after speaking with Jason Talkin, I learned that in the present, most amplifier technicians are men, which kind of shatters the justification that it's necessary to have women with smaller fingers to work on the assembly and manufacturing of these objects. Another anecdote, this time remembered by floor manager Forrest White, quote, "Fender hired some of our employees as soon as they were barely old enough to work. Two of these exceptionally young, good employees, Lupe Duarte and Lily Jayme, has been with him since the day he formed the company. Lupe and Lily were just 17 and 18, respectively, when they began wiring amplifiers for Fender in 1947. Scholars have argued that employers sought out young women as employees because they viewed them as temporary, assuming that they would leave work to get married and have children. In her study on wartime instrument manufacturing in the United States, Sarah Dieter states that the War Production Board encouraged companies to hire women who were housewives without children under the age of 10. They suggested that this specific demographic was ideal because it was believed that these women would be more willing to leave their jobs once veterans returned from the home front. Similar trends have been documented well into the post-war era. Fender's famed pickup winder, Abigail Ibarra, remembers, quote, my cousin Karina had a job at Fender. She used to solder and do wiring. She quit when she was gonna have her first baby. When we went back together looking for a job, they hired me, but they didn't hire her back." While documentation of why Karina was not hired back does not exist, we may consider that her motherhood made her an ineligible employee. It is likely that Karina quit her job at Fender because maternity leave was not an option. Perhaps she was not hired back because she had young children and had to and already had to leave the labor force, which made her seem unreliable. Forrest White also remembers that Fender employees Lupe and Lily both thought Leo Fender was the next thing to a deity. He had almost spoiled them rotten because, hey, these were his kids. He had practically raised them. While White states that Fender spoiled these women, one must also consider that documentation shows that Fender relied on low-paid Mexican-American labor. And it was certainly cheaper to dote on these women in small ways and act paternalistic than to pay them equal wages. Factory owners often used paternalism to manage their young female workforce. Feminist scholar Alice Kessler Harris writes that in addition to denying women sufficient wages to achieve economic independence, employers would turn to using, quote, paternalistic techniques which reinforced a sense of obligation. These conditions were certainly not unique to Fender. In the long history of industrialization, many employers around the world hired women for factory work, and they used paternalism, low wages, and other strategies among the tools at their disposal. I want to now look at exactly who the women of Fender were. Between the years of 1947 and 1965, I have documented more than 30, and actually, as of this morning, almost 40, women who worked in the workshop at Fender during this time, many of whom are Mexican American. Only a small number of women are known by their first and last names. Some women we know by their first names thanks to a quality control practice Forrest White put in place in the mid-1950s. He had factory employees write their names, often just their first names or even initials, on masking tape, which was then adhered to the object they worked on. This signaled that the employees signed off on the instrument after they had worked on it before the next production stage, quote, effectively making each employee both an operator and an inspector. Furthermore, incentive plans set in place by White encouraged speedy yet precise production, and employees could receive monetary incentives for an increase in productivity. But there are also many women who worked at the factory for which we don't know their names. Those pictured in books on Fender are often referred to only as Fender's girls or workers. Thus, I have scoured message boards, obituaries, books, census records, videos, and listened to oral histories in an attempt to identify these women, but also perhaps to find their descendants for the purpose of future oral history interviews. The women of the Fender factory were responsible for hand wiring electromagnetic pickups for guitars, wiring and assembling amplifiers, and sanding and varnishing electric guitars, among other jobs. Pickup winding was a very detailed yet monotonous task for which women were primarily assigned, perhaps due to the task's small-scale labor and what Wagnerova describes as women's stereotypical tolerance for tedium. Yet these hand-wired pickups are now appreciated for being exceptional in quality due to the materials they used and also to their organized approach in the arrangement of the wires. I would now like to introduce a few of the women who worked for Fender in the early days and explore their experiences. Perhaps the most famous female employee of Fender is Abigail Ibarra, dubbed the Queen of Tone for her valuable hand-wound pickups. Ibarra began working for Fender in 1956 at the age of 21, only recently retiring in 2013 from Fender's custom shop. She made pickups for the likes of Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton, among many others, and spent a sum total of 57 years at the company. In an oral history interview for NAMM, Abigail Ibarra remembers that when she began working at the factory, Fender's associate and instrument designer George Fullerton, quote, hired me and took me to the machine shop, and he had me grinding frets with necks, different size frets, grind them and soap them all day. There was a couple of months, and then I asked to be transferred to the main assembly. It wasn't until about 1958 that I started winding pickups. So a little bit that I learned about Abigail is that after her father passed away, she was left with her mom and her sister, and so working at Fender was a really valuable and important economic role in her household. Furthermore, her experiences at Fender helped her, or rather, the camaraderie she felt with the fellow employees, she said, it had her feel like she liked being Latina, which I think is really interesting given, racial issues in the Los Angeles metro area at the time. In an interview for the magazine She Shreds with editor Fabi Reina, Ibarra remembers that many of the women had no interest in the tedious job of winding pickups, that most of the girls would just say it was boring. I mean, you just sit there and you wind. Yet she also reinforces, or perhaps reclaims the gendered narrative of women's nimble fingers by saying that men's hands were just too rough. Men would not be able to handle such delicate work, so it was just women. Author of Pink Noises, Tara Rogers, reiterates that the distinctive prized tone of Fender electric guitars relied on the laboring hands of Hispanic workers who meticulously wound pickups tighter than a machine could. Yet most literature attributes this unique tone to Leo Fender, the American original inventor, not the women who produced the instruments in this way. Ibarra stated that unlike the uniformity of automatic coil winders, which she had to use when the company was bought by CBS and she continued doing pickup winding in that era, that winding by hand winds it differently. This ideal irregularity allows for more airspace in the coil, which allows for the high frequencies to come through. Furthermore, hand-wound pickups are unique in tone, making them a personal signature of the operator who made them. Ibarra is now a legend for her signature sound and has trained her successor, Josefina Campos, to continue her legacy. She was also trained by another woman named Pilar Lopez. So this kind of lineage of women teaching women in this factory setting. I would like to return to Lily, who we saw her name on the tape in the beginning of the talk. She was an expert at wiring amplifiers. Collectors and authors identified two women named Lily who worked at the factory, Lily Sanchez and Lily Jayme. AMIS, really messing that up. A genealogical research deep dive uncovered that they were the same person, Lydia Sanchez Jaimes. She was born in Ventura County, California, just north of Los Angeles in 1929 to Mexican immigrant parents. Lydia married Fred Jaimes, but I have not yet found their wedding date. In 1954, they had their first child, Andrew, and in 1959, they had their second child, Eileen. She remained in Los Angeles her whole life and passed away of cancer at the age of 85 in 2015. Lydia began working with Leo Fender in 1947 at the age of 18. And her name is one of the most frequently found on the amplifiers that I've seen. Looking at her exemplary wiring work, it is clear she was very talented. We know that she worked in the factory as late as 1958 because of the amplifier that I examined here at the center. But I need to do more research to find her latest instruments to figure out her inclusive dates. Since I only just figured this out this week, I have much work ahead of me. Piecing these individual stories of the 30-ish women that have been identified have been quite difficult. Since the factory opened 75 years ago, many of the employees have passed away. Aside from the issues of identifying women without their last names or with common names like employee Lupe Lopez, given the young age of these women, using their maiden names without knowing their married names further complicates things. But it is my hope to seek out relatives of these women in hopes of finding out more information. And especially, I've been using the recently digitized 1950 United States Census to figure out some of these details. So that's kind of the next stage of this research. I have begun creating a database with every name, birth date, active years at Fender, which I've found, and photos when available. I hope by adding the photos to names, I'll be able to further identify other women who are unnamed in photos in these books. Now I'd like to move on to the instruments, and I know I'm running a little late. Yep. Recently, collectors and musicians alike have driven the market for vintage electric guitars and vacuum tube amplifiers, both for their sound and their history. And as such, amplifiers and electric guitars are now sought after collector's items, especially if they have these women's names. Guitar historian and writer Tom Wheeler writes that when he opens up a Fender Tweed Champ amplifier, part of the charm is that when I open up a Tweed amplifier, there's a little piece of tape inside there written, and on the tape is Lupe, the legendary Lupe Lopez, one of Leo Fender's original employees, a housewife who sat there winding amplifiers. Provenance has always driven antique sales, and guitars are no exception. Collectors seek out these high-priced guitars and amps, and they've been romanticized due to the work of these very women, not unlike Fanny's presentation with Marie Antoinette. New York's Retrofit Musical Instruments shop currently has a Fender Harvard model tube amplifier from 1958, bearing the name Lily, and the listing price is $9,000. In 1957 or 8, the same model would have retailed for about $100, which in today's currency would be $1,000. And of course, the market is full of dubious and fake instruments as well. Recently, I found a link to Reverb where a seller was selling a piece of signed tape signed by Gloria Fuentes from an amp for $145. So I've also scoured guitar message boards, and one particularly problematic posting that I saw on the TDPRI Guitar Gear message board. User Jay Guitarman asks if Julia, the woman who signed his Fender Tweed amplifier, was hot back in the day. Oh. There. User Mitch Fitz responds, hot and stuck soldering on an assembly line back in the 1950s? Not likely. Eye candy ladies don't often have to become productive members of our society. Ugh. He then continues with more misogyny, which I just didn't include. Many collectors also use the names of women who worked on them as their identifiers and are seen referring to my Lupe or my Lily. This personification and subsequent fetishization of these products is problematic, especially after their labor is now a mechanism for increased price of on the predominantly white male collector's market. Scholar Lori Marish shows how the sexualization of women in factory jobs, specifically at the Lowell textile mill in the 19th century in Massachusetts, is fraught with images of servility and dehumanization. She also observes how in many popular novels of the time written about the Lowell women, there was an aesthetic valorization for factory life, marked the sublimation of elite men's exploitive, sexual, and economic interest in the working class female body. The women of Fender are becoming increasingly a part of the dialogue about the company's early history, and I've tried to examine these practices and the literature that's been written about them. I feel it's important to be thoughtful about telling these stories because the last thing I want to do is tokenize these women. Thus, my work differs from other studies because I am trying to get to know these women, their backgrounds, and their personal histories to position them as people, not just producers of consumer goods. And yes, to also credit them for the fine work that they did. I also want to provide a retelling of the often told male-dominated narrative about Fender by centering women as actors and shapers of the company's history in order to provide a more scholarly and critical analysis of the company. Much of the literature written about Fender was written by those close to him or those who have looked up to him as a hero. Many of these books provide anecdotal information, yet often lack citations for the details they provide. Furthermore, these books celebrate Fender without providing a critical scholarly lens to examine his life, the company and its leadership, and the workplace practices therein. This is the preliminary stage of my dissertation, so much more to come, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Hi, Jayme. Thank you so much. I'm kind of curious if you know anything about kind of the current labor forces in this industry. When you were talking about this reminded me that a couple years ago I came across an article in just like a local newspaper about the Seymour Duncan pickup operations, which are in Goleta, California, where I used to live. And I was struck by the fact that it seemed like their labor force was overwhelmingly female and Mexican-American or immigrants from Mexico or Central America. So I'm curious if this is something that's kind of part of that industry now.
Very much so. There's a long history of women working in maquiladoras in Mexico, women working in the factories in Japan as well, in the case of Fender. So yeah, like this kind of small-scale labor has been documented in musical instrument manufacturing, but also like RCA was hiring women to do these kinds of tasks. So this kind of goes beyond musical instruments, but yeah, for sure.
Hi, that was amazing. I'm really happy to see this project as it's moving and how you're presenting it. I was wondering if do you know all of the names of the people that worked, like, or are you're hoping to maybe discover new names as you examine different amplifiers?
So there's no like master list of like their staffing, and I have yet to find, like, I've been reaching out to several people, and I haven't really gotten a lot of archival information at this point. That's aside from there's a published book called The Fender Archive, which has facsimiles of some remaining documents. But I have really scoured message boards and kind of done some screen captures to be able to keep this running list. And it's funny because there's so many of these discussion boards, and so it's almost like every single time I look at a new one, I find a new name. Okay. I do want to find out how many male employees they had, because I think it would be really interesting to know the percentage of women to men. Okay. But
great, and I just wanted to add some context to the nimble fingers narrative, because it does come from the maquiladora industry, and it started with a cassette factory because they wanted women to put together by hand cassettes, and somebody sold the idea because all of the men who were deported said none of them are going to work in these factories, so we're going to get their wives to do this. So yeah. It was a cassette factory.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't think I particularly have nimble fingers. Like, I'm kind of clumsy, as we saw yesterday, so.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Hey, Jayme, besides the little labels, are there any distinctive aspects of the work of the individual women that can help you identify them if there isn't a label?
That's a great question, and yes, like 2 days ago was the first time I got to look at one of these objects in person, and then yesterday I got to hear Jason was able to play one of the guitars that was likely made by the women, and then with the amp, so it was like so awesome. So thank you. But he could probably speak to that better than I can, because I have not yet been able to kind of do a comparative analysis of like the sonic properties of these objects in terms of like, I know that like, I guess, you know, the wiring, the kind of, for the pickups, the wiring is not standardized. Like there are gaps and it's irregular. So certain objects would have a signature sound, and certainly like someone like Abigail Ibarra likely had a very signature sound of her objects, but I haven't been able to like sonically identify Lily or Lupe or anyone else.
So it might be like, if somebody were winding left-handed, it might look different.
Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. There's many more questions, I'm sure, so please do contact Jayme.
Please do. And also just a quick plug, if you know of any women instrument makers, past or present, send me information. I'm going to put it on the website. So, thank you.